Mark Wallace sat at his desk in the warehouse and contemplated what he was needing to do about his wife, Willa. He had the evidence in front of him concerning her affair with her boss, Dale Timmons, owner of Timmons Electronics. Timmons Electronics produced small electronic controllers that allowed computers to control mechanical devices. Some were tiny, and some were quite large depending on the application. Mark had been working at Timmons Electronics when he met Willa Miller and successfully wooed her and won her hand in marriage. After a few years, Mark had seen the need for independent warehouses, both dry and refrigerated, so he had gambled and struck out on his own. Willa had not been enthusiastic about the gamble, but had helped by economizing anywhere she could to help out. Now Mark was a 35-year-old successful businessman with 4 huge warehouses and another 100 acres of ground for expansion on the edge of their medium-sized city. A big box store was in need of a new distribution center, and Mark's company was high on the list to provide the structure with a very long-term lease. His refrigerated warehouse was so large that you could park 30 semi-trucks inside without problem and flash freeze meat from the local packing plant without having to unload. This saved a lot of man-hours having to unload trucks to freeze fresh meat and then load again for delivery to distant markets. Through the whole process of getting the business off the ground, through mac and cheese nights when they couldn't even afford hot dogs, Mark and Willa were a team. They kept the wolves from the door as they sweated and strained to finish the first warehouse and get it rented out. Willa was the personal assistant to Dale Timmons. At 5 foot 7 inches tall and about 130 pounds, her looks were average. She was a natural brunette who sometimes got highlights in her wonderful shoulder-length hair. Her legs were long and lean and but was just right. They had made the commitment to get the business off the ground before having children, and Mark was now ready, but Willa had been less than enthusiastic when they last discussed progeny. She was very busy being the number 2 person at Timmons Electronics. Mark knew that even though there were a couple of vice presidents at the company, Willa was the one counted on to get everything done and in a timely manner. Mark had wondered why Willa had a change of heart about kids. Early in their married life, they had discussed how many kids, gender, and even names. Mark was hoping for Rachel, Mike, and Amy, but now Willa wouldn't even discuss them anymore. Their sex life was changing also. Mark understood that sometimes frequency would suffer as a person aged, but he was under the impression that his libido would become less while Willa's would get stronger and peak sometime after age 36 or so. No, Mark's want and need to enjoy the physical aspect of their love was just as strong as when they met, but he couldn't remember the last time Willa had been hot to trot. She didn't want any foreplay or even a kiss. She wanted it to make quick so she can go to sleep. Of course, this only happened a couple of times before Mark just quit asking for sex. This led Mark to the conclusion that Willa was no longer interested in him. Each passing day seemed to make the chasm between them wider. There was little conversation during a meal, during the evening while the idiot box was on, and never any pillow talk after retiring for the night. Willa didn't even seem to care how well the business was doing as long as there was money in the bank. The warehouse business was a separate corporation wholly owned by the Wallace couple and had its own checking and even savings accounts. Mark drew a set amount each payday as their earnings. This kept the profits where the money could do the most good, primarily growing the business. A few years ago, Willa had set up a separate checking account, and her earnings went into that account. Willa did make sure to pay quite a bit of the monthly expenses, and Mark handled the rest. Willa used her own money to pay for her clothing and sundries, including trips to the spa and hairdresser. Mark now decided to use the corporate account to pay for a private investigator to look into Willa and her boss, Dale Timmons. Since Willa never looked at those accounts and, truth be told, none of the records were kept at the house anymore as Mark had a full set of corporate offices in one of the warehouses, she would not casually see anything about the investigation. Mark had known Dale many years, first as an employee of Timmons Electronics and now as a vendor for Timmons. Dale used one of Mark's warehouses, at least a part of one, to store controllers prior to shipping, and so they still had official ties, and also Mark attended every outing put on by Timmons Electronics for the employees. There was a planned spring picnic and a 4th of July celebration with fireworks, and then an early fall picnic that was planned for the last warm days before the snow flew. Then there was the Christmas party in December. Dale also tried to have a one-box pheasant hunt in November that was mostly attended by the male employees and male spouses, but a few women also were avid bird hunters and would join. Willa was not a hunter, so she passed on that event, just planned it, and all the other company events. Mark had never really got the vibe that Willa was involved with Dale, but he was the likely suspect as they spent many hours working together. Willa even traveled with Dale on sales trips and to conventions. Of course, they always had separate rooms, but Mark had never tried to call Willa's room during a trip as she always carried her cell phone and it always had good coverage wherever they traveled. Willa had usually answered any phone call on the first or second ring, and had never seemed out of breath or distracted when she spoke with Mark. On the rare occasion she missed a phone call, she would call back as soon as she could. Sometimes she would return a call at the odd late-night hour citing a working supper or meeting with potential clients. She never missed calling back by waiting until the next day, as so many cheating wife stories had the errant spouse do. No, Mark was suspicious based on Willa's changing attitudes towards children and her distance in their personal life. Now at 35 years of age, Mark was also feeling the biological clock ticking. Not necessarily about whether he could father a child or two, but, more realistically, whether he wanted to be the age of most grandfathers when his children were graduating high school. Waiting even a couple of years would make it harder to get down on the floor and play with his children. Sadly, he realized that if Willa was no longer in love with him or had decided to not have children, then his time for being a parent was also in jeopardy, since he felt it would be a long time before he could establish a new relationship. Dale Timmons was married. His wife, Gretchen, was a good woman and had produced 3 kids for her husband, but had let herself go a little bit. No, she wasn't obese by any means, but she was carrying a lot of baby weight that she didn't seem to want or need to get rid of. Mark could easily see why Dale might be attracted to his slightly younger, and still in good shape, personal assistant. Mark employed a private security service that advertised to be a full-service security company. They did cybersecurity as well as background checks, and then site security to make sure that businesses were fully secure. He called the owner, Chris Couples. An appointment was made and Mark finished his current project and then went to the Security One offices. Chris welcomed him and got him a cup of coffee. After they were comfortable, Chris opened the conversation. "Well, Mark, what brings you over to my office today? Usually you just call if there is a problem with one of my people. Have you been breached somehow?" Mark gave out a sardonic chuckle. "Maybe I have been breached." He put his hand up. "No, not the warehouses. They're all just fine. Our computers and the network are secure as far as I can see." He paused to give out a deep sigh. "No, it is my wife, Willa. We are becoming more and more like strangers. Our sex life is in the toilet. I want kids, and she won't even discuss the possibility anymore. I don't have any proof, but I am wondering if she doesn't have someone else, and I am just providing a house to live in now." Chris took all of this seriously. Anytime a long-time married person started to suspect a dalliance, there was usually fire at the base of the smoke that was being sensed. Of course, Mark could be mistaken, and Willa was innocent, but history says otherwise. Any investigation would have to be very discreet, so as not to alarm Willa and potentially permanently damage her marriage to Mark. "I have a couple of good investigators. As a matter of fact, the best one is a woman and is very good at her job. I think she lives for catching errant spouses. Actually, she is great at any kind of investigation. Her background checks are more thorough than most others, and she really gets into recovery of insured stolen goods." Mark nodded. She, whoever she was probably the best to assign to this. Chris went on. "Who are you thinking is the person Willa is involved with?" "There have been no overt indications, but the one I would most suspect would be her boss, Dale Timmons, of Timmons Electronics." Chris should have guessed, as he knew where Willa worked. "There might be a slight conflict of interest. We provide patrol security for Timmons. Dale Timmons has never really been concerned about most other types of security, so we just drive by and check the doors at night." He sat and contemplated his situation for a few moments, then made a phone call. "Lisa, is Tom in right now?" There was a pause. "Hello, Tom. This is Chris Couples. I have a quick question for you. Is there any conflict of interest if one of my clients comes and asks me to run an investigation, personal of course, on another of my clients?" "There is no investigation of the businesses themselves, just officials of the 2 businesses." There was another pause. "Okay, yes, I see. Thanks for the information." Chris hung up the phone. "That was my lawyer. He says that there could be construed a conflict of interest, but since the corporations themselves have hired our services and not the principals, then there should not be any concern. I hope that you weren't going to pay me through the corporation checking account." Mark looked a little chastised. "I actually had considered that so that Willa wouldn't see the bill. I will just use some savings for your fee and not have an official tie to the business. I can transfer some money to myself to reimburse my savings account if necessary." Once the investigation was launched, Mark felt a little relieved. No matter what was found out, it would give him information about his wife and his marriage and possibly the future of any progeny. Mark didn't immediately consult a divorce attorney or even go to all the local good attorneys and get them to give him a consult meeting so that Willa would not be able to get a shark should divorce be in the future. He didn't immediately raid their joint accounts and move money. He didn't have his accountant move money to the Cayman Islands. Nope, he didn't do anything except go back to work. Life continued as before. The Wallaces coexisted as they had for months. Mark and Willa shared a bed but seldom attempted to have any kind of sex life. They still didn't talk much, and Mark never broached the subject of children. He just kind of retreated into himself and started to consider his future, a future where Willa wasn't any part of. Chris provided updates, but his investigator was going undercover, so there was not any news for quite a while. Chris told Mark that his best PI was now working at Timmins Electronics and checking into the working relationship between Willa and her boss, Dale, and also looking into any unusual business practices. Mark understood the need for slow and methodic investigations, but was a little anxious about what might be found. Finally, many months later, there was a report for Mark. He and Chris sat down and went over the entire package of documentation. It appeared complete. There were transcripts of emails, text messages, and cell phone conversations. There were also videos from the various out-of-town meetings. There was no doubt that Willa and her boss were an item. Some of the transcripts were further disheartening as Willa made many disparaging remarks about Mark and his prowess as a lover. Chris was quick to point out that many times cheaters trash-talk their spouses during sex talk to help make themselves feel less guilty. Dale made many references to his own wife's frigidity, as if that would make Mark feel any better. Mark now was faced with the questions about his marriage, and to an extent, his business. Willa was a co-owner, and it might break him to buy out her share. The local economy was good, so the value of the business was high. It was good for business, but severely damaging in the case of divorce. He had to start to plan on what he was going to do. Should he confront Willa and demand that she come back and be faithful to only him? Should he just move out and live separately from Willa? Should he throw her to the curb and suffer the consequences that might include selling the business? Or should he just ignore the whole thing and hope it blew over someday? He also had to consider whether to let Gretchen Timmins know what he had found out. What if she divorced Dale? Would he then put the full court press on Willa to dump Mark? So many questions and so few clear-cut answers. The mere contemplation was enough to give Mark a severe headache that was accompanied by nausea and the need to find a quiet, dark room. Willa had noticed that Mark seemed more distant than usual, and now a severe headache caused her concern. She spent a rare evening trying to make her husband feel better. She made him some soup and, surprise, it wasn't just from a can. She kept the noise down from the TV while he was resting. She checked on him periodically to see how he was feeling. Mark appreciated the gestures, especially the soup, but had to wonder why now Willa was actually feeling something for him. As his headache cleared, he started to plan. Even off the wall and extreme plans and dreams were healthier than wallowing in grief for his lost marriage. He came out of the illness with a new resolve. He fell asleep working on the details of his plan to expose his wife and her lover to the community. He would not tell Gretchen. She could find out when everyone else was faced with the secret life of Willa and Dale. The next morning he woke and actually smiled at the form of his wife in the bed next to him. He got up, shaved and had a nice hot shower and then got dressed. Willa was just stirring when he was ready to leave the bedroom and get his breakfast. "Rise and shine, dear. Thank you for everything last night. I feel great. I don't know why I had a nasty headache, but it is gone now, and I am ready to get on with the rest of my life, thanks to you." He bent and gave her a kiss on the cheek. Willa didn't speak as she was still trying to wake up, and now her husband was cheerful and full of life when recently he had been so down and depressed and would hardly attempt to talk with her. She soon showered and dressed and joined him for a cup of coffee. Her breakfast was usually taken with Dale in his office. Sometimes they actually had something to eat. Mark sat and told her that he was going to go ahead with the new warehouse. The big box company was balking at making a commitment about the distribution center, so the plans had been on hold. Mark justified his decision by laying out the history for Willa that every one of their current warehouses had been a risk but were now paying off. A huge empty building might not get the big box company off the mark, but might tempt other companies looking for the same thing. That is, affordable sites in good areas with access to interstates and rail to ease shipping woes. Willa finally had to let Mark go ahead with his plan, as he had been right so far in every other decision about the company. Wallace Warehouses was about to expand again. Mark also needed the construction to begin, as it might help make his plan work better. He went to the office and called in his right-hand person, Kelly Parsons, and got her started on the construction. He then called his attorney and set out to update his will. While in the attorney's office, he updated his plan of succession for the corporation should he no longer be able to run the company for any reason. His attorney had been hounding Mark to do just that for many months, so there was no real eyebrow raising at his plan. Willa would still be the majority stockholder should Mark die or become incapacitated. She would not, though, have any input into how the business was operated. She would benefit from any profit made, but Kelly would become the CEO and only have to inform Willa how the business was doing. Willa would be limited on how much she could withdraw monetary-wise so that she couldn't raid the profits and force the company to shut down. She could sell the company, but she couldn't destroy it. Now came the rest of the plan. Mark slowly took some money from the company coffers. A couple of hundred here and a couple of hundred there. Over the upcoming weeks, he amassed about $10,000 for his planned disappearance. He wouldn't be gone long, just a week or two. But by the time he came back, all the damage should be done. He visited a veterinary supply store and procured a couple of needles for syringes. He didn't need the syringes, so no eyebrows were raised. He also went into the store dressed like the average livestock producer, so it also helped with getting what he needed. He then did exhaustive searches on the internet for what he needed to know, but went to the public library so that any investigation into his personal and business computers would not reveal his interest in the particular subjects. At home, he continued to smile and talk with Willa. She responded and even initiated a sexual interlude or two. It was bittersweet to Mark that now, so late in the game, that she remembered who her husband was. He mentally debated during the first encounter whether he should beg off sex with Willa, but decided that he had no evidence of an STD, and he had no idea of when he would get sexual relief again, so he might as well enjoy these few interludes while he could. Mark and Willa also attended the spring celebration at Timmins Electronics. There was a catered buffet for the employees and families along with games for both adults and children. Prizes were given out to adult winners. Each child received a small toy for coming and being part of the event. Mark made sure to not imbibe too much alcohol as he was not sure he could keep from getting into a confrontation with his rival, Dale. He avoided any real conversation with the man, but did sit and gab with Gretchen for a while before joining other small groups of conversationalists. It was a good evening, even though Willa disappeared with Dale for a short while. Needless to say, Willa didn't initiate any sex with Mark after they returned home. Mark didn't press the issue. The construction of the new warehouse was now in the dirt-moving phase to prepare the site for the huge concrete pad that would make up the floor. It was time to start the plan. Mark stayed late at his office one evening. With the needle from the veterinary supply house, Mark set out to withdraw some of his own blood. He had debated being able to do this, but rationalized that narco addicts access their own veins all the time, so he could also. Mark applied the makeshift tourniquet according to the information he had gotten from the internet after swabbing the area with an alcohol swab. The vein in his elbow raised up nicely and made a good target. After taking a deep breath and holding it, he made the initial stab. Thankfully, he must have done something right as there was blood coming out of the needle and into the clear tubing he had found at a hardware store and down into the plastic bag. He knew that he should only take about a pint of blood at a time to keep from getting too weak, so he watched it flow very carefully. When the bag was full enough, he used a pair of locking pliers and clamped the tubing and released the tourniquet. The needle was then taken out, and he applied direct pressure for the prescribed 5 minutes. He was pleased to note that there was not any bruising around the area of the small wound that was left over. He figured that if he could get away without using a band-aid when he got home, that Willa would not notice the wound. Now he had some blood for his plan. He had thought about using blood from a fresh cow or pig, but DNA testing by any reputable laboratory would soon figure out what he had done. No, it needed to be human blood, and in particular his blood, for the plan to work. To keep the blood from clotting in the bag, he had read that an anticoagulant was needed. He worried about getting that until he read that rat poison was primarily an anticoagulant. He had then purchased a box of rat and mouse poison for putting into the bag. He didn't know how much to put in, so it was a trial and error activity. He then put the bag of his own blood into the mini fridge in his office. It had a key lock so that no one else would be looking in it for anything. He cleaned the needle and the tubing and hung them to dry. He would need to gather another pint or so of blood to fully implement his plan, but needed to recover first. Later that evening, he set the next phase of his plan into motion. First, he went online and set up a profile under Willa's name and used her email address to set up a new life insurance policy for $1 million just on his own life and not Willa's. He then started to call members of his and Willa's families, along with all their friends and some of Willa's co-workers. Since he didn't have phone numbers of all of them, he made a call to Dale Timmins. "Say, Dale, this is Mark Wallace. Can you do me a favor? Willa's birthday is in about 3 weeks, on the 18th, and I am planning a surprise birthday party at our house. Could you let all of your employees know about the party?" Dale was supportive. "Hell, yes, I will. Willa is a valuable member of my staff and a great person besides. I am sure a lot of my employees would be glad to come and surprise her. Can I help any other way?" Since Mark wasn't supposed to know of his wife's extracurricular activities, he acted the clueless cuck. "Yes, Dale, if you could. Would you keep Willa late that evening and bring her home at about 7 o'clock or so? That would give everyone else a chance to get into the house and hide." Dale was obviously willing to keep Willa occupied. Mark was sure after he hung up that Willa would show up at home on her birthday. In the next few days, Mark arranged for a nice birthday gift and a large cake. He also contracted with a caterer for food for the event. The caterer would come in and set up about the time the first guest would arrive. The construction contractors were getting ready to pour footings on the new large warehouse when Mark decided to give up another pint of his blood and have enough for his plan. Again, he tied the tourniquet and then placed the needle in the healed area of his arm and got another pint. This time, he carefully placed the used needle and tubing into a dumpster behind the medical clinic. He figured no one would look twice at it. That night, he waited until Willa was sleeping and brought the rat poison container into the bedroom while wearing gloves. He had carefully wiped it down before after donning the gloves. He then used Willa's hands to grasp and otherwise leave multiple fingerprints on the container. He then put the container back in the secure cabinet in the garage. Then came the day of the surprise party. Mark had arranged for one of Willa's family to come a little early and be there as he had come up with an excuse to be late. Mark didn't go to work that day. He just drove around the corner and parked until Willa left. He went back to the house. Mark put on his rain gear and laid down on the bed. He poured most of the 2 pints of blood onto the suit and let it run off and soak into the bedding. Any police officer would assume that a massive blood loss had occurred since regular clothing would absorb a lot of blood. He counted on the CSI team to figure that he had lost a majority of his blood. He then got up and didn't try to keep from dripping blood from the rain suit and used the shower to clean off most of the residue. Then it was off to the kitchen. He dipped the knife from Willa's favorite cutlery set in the blood and then cleaned it and put it back into the block. He counted on an investigator looking for minute residue blood clues. He also got out a glass and poured a drink of alcohol in it and spiked it with rat poison. He then poured the drink down the kitchen drain and rinsed the glass and put it in the dishwasher. Mark then got out a sheet of plastic and put a bunch of tools and other heavy items on the sheet, and then put some of the blood in the end of the plastic, and then rolled up the plastic and dragged it out of the bedroom and down the hall and out to the garage, and then outside to the spot he found that Dale always parked at. There were scrape marks on the ground and the occasional drop of blood. Mark then went back into the house and put a letter he had printed out on the table for all to see and note. It read, "Willa, I was called away on emergency business. Please enjoy your birthday without me, and I will help you celebrate when I get back in a week or 2. Mark didn't sign it. He then put the envelope with the documentation of Dale and Willa's affair into the top drawer of his desk for the police to find. Mark noticed that some of the residual blood on his rain gear had also dripped on the floor, but he just left it and took off the gear and put it all into a trash bag. He left the lights on, made sure to not take anything one might normally take on a trip, and then took the trash bag and walked to a dumpster behind a local bottle shop and buried it in the dumpster. He went back to the house and hid outside to wait for his wife and her lover to arrive. Willa's cousin arrived on time, and the caterer just happened to pull up at the same time. They all went inside. Some of the other guests arrived in a few minutes and went inside. Mark was disappointed. It seemed to take a long time before someone started making some commotion about the drops of blood on the floor of the house. Then things started to happen. A police cruiser came screaming up the street and stopped outside the Wallace household. Mark kept to his hiding place. More guests arrived, and so did more cops. There started to be a large group of people not allowed into the house. At 7 o'clock, Dale and Willa arrived in Dale's pickup. The large amount of police cruisers, friends and family vehicles, and even an ambulance kept the cheating duo from parking close to the house. They exited the pickup and approached the crowd. Mark took the opportunity to sidle down the street and approach Dale's pickup from the rear and then drip a couple of drops of blood into the box. He also placed a roll of duct tape that had a smear of blood on it and a small chunk of plastic sheet that also had a smear of blood on it into the back of the box. Then Mark walked away knowing he had created some chaos. A couple of blocks away, he flagged down a cab and had it take him near his new warehouse site. He left the cab a ways from the new site and then walked in. The footings had all been poured but were still setting up. He dropped a couple more samples of blood onto the ground in the forms. He then walked away and went to a small hotel. He had to walk about 2 miles, but he didn't want any more trail to him. He paid cash for the room. His plan was to stay away for about a week or so before suddenly appearing hale and hearty. He was betting that gossip or the police, maybe both, would be led to Willa and Dale, and their affair would become public knowledge. Mark slept well that night. The next day he went and bought an electronic tablet with cash and then went back to the hotel and fired it up using the public Wi-Fi of the hotel. He soon was logged into a social media site and sought out some of the guests at the party. One was Willa's cousin, who was a notorious gossip and the main reason Mark asked her to come to the party early. Her post was as follows: "I couldn't believe it. I arrived at the same time as the caterer and we went into the kitchen so he and his crew could get set up. We didn't really see anything until one of the men slipped on a blood spot on the floor. By then others were also showing up, and I was helping them get drinks in the living room. The caterer backtracked the blood spots out to the driveway where they suddenly disappeared. He then came back and grabbed me, and we went to the bedroom. When we opened the door, I almost passed out. There was so much blood on the bed. It looked like someone had slaughtered a pig or something. We closed the door and called the police. More and more people were arriving. After the first cop got there, he ordered everyone to stay out of the house, except for all of us who had come in and found the blood. More cops arrived and gathered the crowd outside and started to question them. When they found out that it was in Willa's honor, they then started to ask where she was. At 7, she came up to the crowd and asked what was going on. She had a smile on her face, so I suppose she thought it was her birthday party. I don't know what anyone outside knew, but I suppose the speculation was driving the conversation. The cops immediately grabbed her and her boss and ushered them into cars, and I guess off to the police station for interrogation. We all knew it then. Mark was missing. The bed was bloody, as though someone might have attacked him while he was sleeping and then had disposed of the body but hadn't had time to come back and clean up. I hate to say it, but Willa didn't know about the party, and that makes it look like she did something to Mark but couldn't finish the job. Mark had taken the battery out of his cell phone so it couldn't be traced to him. He listened to a local talk radio station and their hourly news story. He watched the news at noon. They reported the story of the missing businessman and that Willa and Dale were persons of interest in the case. The police held a news conference and just announced that the investigation was just starting, and if anyone had any information concerning Mark Wallace, to contact the police immediately. Mark realized that he had not anticipated his picture being plastered on the TV and in the newspaper. He wouldn't be able to go out unless he was in disguise. He decided to quit shaving. He had always kept himself clean-shaven even when off fishing, so this would not be expected. He assumed the police would come up with a profile of him to aid in their search. He also told himself to avoid any of his regular destinations while missing. His looks were nondescript enough that he felt he could go out to a nearby fast food restaurant and get food. After eating, he decided to grab a bus and go to a nearby community that was located on a popular fishing lake. It would give him more to do than sit and stew in a hotel. First, though, he visited a local secondhand clothing store and found some togs that would be appropriate for someone going fishing but didn't look new. Once established in a small cabin, he spent the day sitting on the shore and casting his cheap rod and reel and trying hard to not catch anything. He engaged in conversation with other anglers. They each had a hooper of a tale about the one that got away. Mark made up his own whopper tale to share with them. Each evening he would check the local paper and the news. There was not much, as police are notoriously close-mouthed during an investigation. The commentators, though, were another story. They were vociferous in their condemnation of Willa and Dale. Somehow the media had found out about the affair, or at least sniffed out a scent of the affair, and were embellishing the story with speculation that the average citizen was taking as gospel. Mark checked the social media site, and Willa's cousin was posting more opinions. She related that Willa's parents had received death threats concerning Mark's disappearance. Mark felt sorry for them, as they had always been welcoming and had made him feel like one of the family. Mark's own parents had died a few years apart from that dreaded C word. He still had chills and almost wept when he heard of anyone getting diagnosed with cancer. He couldn't say the word either. He always referenced it as C. He had a morbid thought. Maybe Willa would come down with cancer and Dale would catch it. Yes, he knew quite well that cancer is not contagious, but his mind, that tiny part that wanted Willa to suffer, had its own petty dreams and fantasies. He really didn't want her to die, just suffer a bit. Thinking about collateral damage now, after the fact, made him sad that he had not figured that Willa's parents and other family might be harmed by his actions. After being gone for a week and a half, Mark happened to get a glimpse of a news conference from his hometown. He didn't get the whole story, but it seemed that Willa and Dale had been indicted on murder charges. Based on that, he did a search on his tablet for anything attached to Willa Wallace's name. He found a couple of articles on the website for his hometown paper. Mark smiled as he read the article. He had forgotten that the local district attorney was up for re-election and his opponent was very popular. It was unusual for any prosecutor to go public this soon in an investigation, but any trial would be after the election, so the district attorney was trying to get a bump in his poll numbers by grabbing the credit for nabbing Mark's attackers now, since the trial would be far after the election. The paper quoted the DA extensively. 2 weeks ago, a local businessman, Mark Wallace, owner of Wallace Warehouses, went missing from his home. When family and friends came to the house, they found blood on the floor and marks on the floor showing where something heavy had been dragged outside and then presumably placed in a vehicle, possibly a pickup, and then left the scene. Further investigation showed a blood-stained mattress in the Wallace's master bedroom and blood on the floor and into the bathroom. We also discovered that someone had taken a shower before the scene was presumably interrupted by family and friends arriving for a surprise birthday party for Mrs. Wallace. There was blood residue in the drain that matched the blood on the bed. Samples were sent to DNA testing and showed that the blood was from Mark Wallace. Due to the large amount of blood saturating the bed, the coroner is making the assessment that Mr. Wallace was killed in his bed and then his body was moved. Further investigation showed a large amount of the anticoagulant warfarin, the active ingredient of rat poison, was present in the blood. Crime scene investigators found a container of rat poison in the house and Mrs. Wallace's fingerprints were on the container. Mrs. Wallace has denied knowing about or touching the rat poison. No other fingerprints were found on the container. We also discovered a glass in the dishwasher that had not been cleaned yet. This glass had the residue of rat poison in it. The only fingerprints on that glass belonged to Mark Wallace. We also found a knife in the cutlery block that had blood residue on it. That blood also matches Mr. Wallace's DNA. There was a letter to Mrs. Wallace found on the kitchen table that purportedly was from Mr. Wallace and apologized to Mrs. Wallace for having to be out of town to meet with a client. It was not signed and had been printed from a home computer and printer. We could not find any evidence that Mr. Wallace had taken any clothing or toiletries with him if he was leaving for a visit. His car was in the garage. We questioned his business associate, Kelly Parsons, and she was able to tell us that Mr. Wallace was not scheduled to visit a client at this time. He has not replied to phone messages, and we cannot find his cell phone by tracking it. It has either had its battery removed, or the battery is completely flat, or buried so deep that no signal can get out. It is presumed that Mr. Wallace met with an unfortunate end. The search for his body is continuing. As for a motive, it was discovered that Mr. Wallace had evidence showing Mrs. Wallace and her boss, Dale Timmons, owner of Timmons Electronics Manufacturing Company, were engaged in an ongoing affair. Furthermore, an independent investigation report was made available to our office, and it shows that Timmons Electronics is in financial difficulty and is in need of a cash infusion. Investigation of Mrs. Wallace's email trail shows a new life insurance policy on Mr. Wallace for $1 million. Blood trace was discovered in Mr. Timmons' pickup that was parked at the Wallace's house that night of the surprise party. Police also found a roll of duct tape and some plastic in the vehicle with Mr. Wallace's blood on them. Thus, I am asking for a grand jury indictment of capital murder even though we have not recovered a body. This is an unusual request, but our office feels that the two people who had the motive and the most to gain by murder may try to flee the country as both travel extensively and have active passports. Mark had a very satisfied look on his face after finishing the article. There was additional commentary by one of the paper's columnists about people who cheat on their spouses and what should be done to them. The only downside that Mark could see was what would happen to him when he suddenly appeared hale and hearty. Could he be charged with a crime? He would have to do something quickly before the DA ended up looking like a fool. Mark jumped on the bus and headed for the next nearest city of any kind. He then hit a local convenience store that sold cell phones and charged by the minute. Of course, they would ask him for identification, but he told the clerk he had lost his wallet and his cell phone and needed to contact his family so he could get them all replaced and get home safely. Thankfully, the clerk bought the story. Mark figured that, as a tourist town, this very scenario might happen often enough to not cause consternation. Mark then called the tip line set up by his local police force and identified himself. There was a pause when the operator decided to believe him. He was placed on hold, and then a few minutes later a detective answered the phone. "This is Police Detective Mike Rollins. I need you to understand that this conversation is being recorded and the call is being traced per department policy. Now, how may I help you?" "Detective Rollins, this is Mark Wallace. I believe you are looking for me in conjunction with an incident at my home. I just want to assure you and the district attorney that I am well and uninjured. I set up the whole scenario involving my wife, her lover and boss, and our family and friends to let them all know that I knew about Willa's affair. I understood that the police would most likely be called in, but I did not believe that charges would be filed before I returned to set the whole situation straight. I never intended for anyone to be embarrassed except Willa and Dale." The good detective then questioned Mark extensively to determine whether this was the real Mark Wallace and not an imposter. The poser list stood at 25 right now. A murder case always brought out the strange and unhappy who would do almost anything for their 15 minutes of fame, even risk jail or prison time. These poor people who confessed to crimes took up much of the police's time as all leads had to be investigated. Rollins told Mark this after he was convinced he was talking to the real Mark Wallace. "Mr. Wallace, we need you to come in. We need to discuss this whole episode. As soon as I can, I will let the DA's office know that you are indeed alive and well. Are you, or have you been in any danger?" Mark shook his head even though he knew Detective Rollins couldn't see his move. "No, Detective, I am not in any danger and I am not being coerced. I left town a few days after starting this whole shebang. I didn't include anyone in my plans. Partly this was to keep the whole thing secret until I was ready to pull the trigger, so to speak, and also to keep anyone else from being implicated in case I did break a law or two. I have also not contacted an attorney except to change my will before all this happened and to keep my wife from destroying my business by keeping it out of her clutches. Mark assumed that the local police would have been alerted to his presence in their town by Detective Rollins. He fully understood that all cell phones can be tracked by the 911 system. He, thus, was walking down the street and continuously moving as he talked. A local bus stopped at the corner, so he jumped on and paid the money to the driver. He didn't really care where he went right now. He could always get back to the bus depot and head back to his rented cabin. Just as he did so, a police patrol car drove past, and he could see the officer craning his neck to check out anyone who would match Mark's description and using a phone. "Detective, I know that you have tracked this cell phone and that the local PD is now searching for me. I will not resist arrest if they catch up to me, but I have no intention of coming in right now. I have let you know that I am not missing or dead. I know that the DA will have some embarrassment, but I assume he is tactful and astute enough to turn this situation to his advantage without looking too foolish. The average citizen will realize he was just following the evidence and had the public's best interest at heart. I am taking out the battery now, and I will contact you again soon." Before Detective Rollins could interject any comment, Mark hit end and immediately pulled the back off the phone and pulled the battery out. No signal could now be sent. He looked out the back of the bus as it turned a corner and watched a patrol car go on down the street and not follow the bus. Mark got off at the next stop and inquired about which bus to take back to the depot. He was soon back on the ride back to his cabin. After getting back to the cabin, Mark took a chance and put the battery back into the phone. He didn't believe the police could track it when the phone moved from city to city between uses. He called his attorney and soon was giving him the whole story of what he had done. His attorney wasn't happy. "Mark, you could be charged with a multiple of crimes starting with conspiracy. You admitted that you knew the police would get involved, and you intended the Willa and Dale would be accused. The DA might even try to get you for filing a false police report as you knew the police would be involved in this. You have now alienated every friend and relative who believes that you have been murdered. Willa might even go after me since you just changed your will and the succession order at your business. How do I prove I had no knowledge of what you were planning and did?" The attorney went on for a bit before finally getting control again. "So, now what do you want to do?" Mark knew his old friend would not be happy with him, so he had not tried to stop his diatribe or even correct him on some false thoughts that he had. "Right at the moment, I suppose I need representation with the DA's office. I am sure that Detective Rollins will get him involved immediately before the man can call another press conference about the grand jury." He stopped and let the attorney acknowledge that. "Then I would like you, or someone who specializes in divorce law, to file for divorce from Willa. I have not had any contact with her or any of our friends or family, but I would imagine she has been ostracized since this all went down. This was my intended outcome all along. I wanted her to figuratively wear the scarlet letter A and have the entire community against her and that shithead, Dale Timmons. When the time is right, and I will leave that up to you. I want Dale served with alienation of affection papers. I don't know if he has a non-fraternization policy, but he needs to pay for screwing my wife." Mark paused and thought as his attorney jotted down some thoughts. "I guess I might also need someone to fade the heat for me when I come back. I don't think I could face reporters right now. I am sure they would ask very embarrassing questions I have no intention of answering about the whole thing. The affair, the party, what I did, who I set up, the whole thing." His attorney agreed, and they set up a way for Mark to remain in contact, just in case the DA went after a wiretap on the attorney's phone system. Mark hung up and then called Kelly Parsons, his chief operations officer or COO. "Kelly, this is Mark." Kelly promptly hung up. He called again using the switchboard and, after identifying himself, had the phone transferred to Kelly's office but asked the receptionist to listen in and reconnect him if she hung up on him again. It was a minute or so before Kelly picked up the phone. Mark assumed that the receptionist, a longtime employee, advised Kelly to listen to Mark this time as he knew the policies involving phone conversations. "This is Kelly Parsons. How may I help you?" "Kelly, don't hang up on me again. I would hate to have to find someone to replace you. This is Mark." "How do I know it's you?" Mark chuckled. "My little experiment in framing someone has worked all too well. I understand why you are skeptical, as it does look like I died in my bed and someone absconded with my body. I do assure you, though, that I am alive and well." Kelly went through the 20-question thing to reassure herself that this was actually her boss and friend. When she was assured he was alive, and talking to her, then she had other questions. When are you coming back? I am assuming you are not here in the city. Have you contacted Willa yet? Mark got serious. Let me answer your questions one at a time. First, I don't know when I will be coming back home. My attorney is talking to the DA since I may have fractured a law or two with my stunt. Hopefully they can negotiate an end to this that doesn't need me to serve jail time. Second, I have no intention of talking to my wife in the near future. She has been carrying on with that dipshit for too long. She has just been using me for a place to sleep and pay her bills while carrying on with Dale. Kelly gave a surprising response. I wish you would talk with her. Yes, I agree she was doing something extremely disrespectful to you and your marriage, but the thought that you might be dead has shook her to the core. I won't say that she loves you, but she does hold you in high regard. She has been calling here almost daily. At first I thought that she was trying to take over the company, and I was loath to talk with her. When I did talk to her, I found out that her whole family has disowned her for all of her peccadillos and the accusation that she might have murdered you. She has no one to talk to. She has been devastated with worry about you. When the evidence came out that you knew about her affair, she told me that she could see how anyone would believe she had something to do with your disappearance. On top of that, the DA announced yesterday that Dale was in financial trouble. She immediately contacted me about that and wondered if Dale had you done away with and was setting her up for the fall. I guess I can understand her position. I actually only wanted to publicly humiliate her for what she has done to me and to us. Here we struggled to get the business off the ground and become profitable so that then we could start our family. Recently, she wouldn't even talk about children anymore. We had picked out names. We bought the house in anticipation of filling the bedrooms with kids. We had a plan. She decided on her own that she was more important than us. Some of the comments that were provided to me in the transcripts and the recordings showed that she doesn't love or respect me. I am wasting my time in this relationship, and I was getting depressed knowing I might not get to be a father until I find someone else, and I might be getting too old to enjoy being a dad. She had to pay. He paused to catch his breath and calm down. He was becoming angry. I know this wasn't the best idea to get this out into the public, but I was becoming angry at how she was treating our marriage and the possibility of how she could destroy everything we worked on if we divorced. At least this way I might lose everything, but she will still carry the stigma of what she did to us. He paused again. Hell, with the way the media plays all of this, she will always be the woman who might have done in her husband. The news reports after I return from the dead will not be as salacious as the ones when I disappeared. Many people will completely discount the fact that I am still alive and keep thinking she is a murderous witch. They switched gears and Kelly brought Mark up to speed on the business. The huge warehouse was still being constructed. Kelly didn't say anything about whether the blood spilled at the site had gotten any attention except the fact that the police had called in some very powerful ground radar instruments and had scanned all the footings along with other construction sites looking for his body. Cash flow was fine. Willa had only tapped one account to set up her attorney. There was no other cash outflow that was unanticipated. When Mark felt he was fully caught up, he promised Kelly he would contact Willa and let her know he was alive. She provided him with an alternate number since Willa's phones, both landline and cell, were jammed with people either condemning her, praising her, yes, some people actually believe she did a good thing, or news media trying to get a scoop on everyone else. Willa was also in hiding somewhere in the city. She had to promise the DA she would not attempt to leave town for any reason. Dale was also in hiding. He was getting mostly death threats. His business was tanking. Many of his customers were canceling orders or putting them on hold until his personal problems could be addressed. Gretchen had filed for divorce immediately after the first news story broke. She apparently was fed up with his philandering ways and was not going to stand by her man as he was accused of killing her lover's husband. She even put a restraining order on him. Mark was happy to hear that news. Mark had to charge his cheap cell phone after the long conversation with Kelly. The call to Willa would have to wait until after lunch. He left his phone and walked down to the restaurant overlooking the marina and ate. Getting back to his cabin, he found his phone was fully charged, so he started to dial Willa but stopped. She probably wouldn't answer a call from a strange number. He dug out his personal phone and put the battery back in and then dialed her new number. She would be able to see by her caller ID who it was. Willa answered on the third ring. She was hesitant. Mark had thought to twist the knife, so to speak, by starting out speaking in a ghostly voice, but decided Willa had probably suffered enough. Willa, this is Mark. He paused for her reaction. It was very quiet for a long time. Mark finally broke the silence. Willa, are you there? This is Mark. I am alive and unharmed. She started to bawl. It wasn't even just crying. It sounded like a full-out complete breakdown. Mark tried a couple of times to talk, but it was obvious that she was not hearing anything right at the moment. He He held his tongue until she started to get back into control. Finally, through her hiccups, slobbering, and hoarse throat from the crying, she managed to ask, "Mark, is this really you? You sound like him, but so did some of the others. How can I be sure?" Mark reminded her of the first time they got caught in the rain during a date. They had been in the middle of a tryst when the deluge had started. Of course, they had never talked about the incident with anyone else. "Oh, Mark, it is you. You said something about others sounding like me. What happened?" "Over the last week, I would get some phone calls. Some even came from your cell phone number, and a couple of them came from the house phone number. I suppose a hacker stole the numbers. Each time a ghostly voice that vaguely sounded like you would accuse me of murder. It was driving me crazy. The only reason I answered this time was because Kelly called me a few minutes ago and told me you were alive and going to call me." She gulped and then must have put down the phone to blow her nose and dry her eyes. When she picked the phone back up, she continued, "I was shocked when she called. With all the evidence, I was starting to believe you had been killed and then your body hidden. I even accused Dale of that. The only thing I knew was that I was innocent." Before Mark could retort, she continued, "I don't know whether I should be relieved that you are alive or be mad at you for what you have done to me and to us. I want to hug you and shake you at the same time. If I yell at you, it is just because I was so worried about you and scared you were dead. At the same time, I want to know why you did this. Why, Mark? Have I treated you that badly?" Mark knew this conversation was going to go downhill quickly. He had to get his dig in, and then he could hang up. "First, Willa, you were screwing Dale, your boss. Second, you wouldn't contemplate having any children. Third, our sex life was in the toilet. Fourth, you seem to just be using our house as a place to sleep and stay out of the elements while carrying on your work and your affair. You didn't seem to give a damn about anything we had ever planned. You wouldn't confide in me anymore. The only thing you were interested in was how the business was doing, so you wouldn't have to worry about money. I bet you even came back to our house that night. Yes, I know that you gave him full access to your body." She started to object, but Mark hung up and shut off the phone. He then pulled the battery again and put the phone in his duffel bag. Mark was now exhausted. His bones even ached. He supposed that he had been tense this whole day. First the trip to the city, then the phone call to Detective Rollins. After that the cat and mouse game with the local cops, and then the trip back here. The phone calls after getting back to his cabin just put paid to his whole day. He decided on a nap. When he woke, it was dark. He walked to the restaurant and had a light meal. As he ate, he tried to decide what he should do in the near future. He was getting bored here. Fishing was okay for a short time, but he couldn't just hang out here forever. It was time to move on. After he walked back to the cabin, he turned on the TV. He had never been much of a television watcher, but had always enjoyed sports and news channels. He checked the local news to see if the DA had announced that Mark was alive, but there was no mention of the case today. Mark figured that the politician was still trying to decide how to spin the fact that Mark had hoodwinked them all without the DA looking the fool. He searched the guide for some kind of show to watch and settled on an old rerun of The Fugitive. He figured he might get an idea of what to do since the show was about a convicted murderer who moved from place to place trying to clear his name at the same time trying to keep from being caught. Should he do the same? He still had the bulk of the $10,000 in cash with him. Unlike the 1960s, when the show had first aired, he would have access to the internet, his credit cards, and, as he banked at a large national bank, he would have access to his money anywhere. He would have contact with his attorney from virtually anywhere. The same with Kelly. She could contact him at any time. She was a good business person, and he could count on her keeping the operation running. Any new contracts could be handled via FedEx if necessary, and he could fly in and meet with a prospective client and then fly out again without the police knowing about it. In the morning, he went online and started to plan his extended vacation. He decided on the East Coast first of all. That was where a lot of the nation's history was concentrated. He had always wanted to explore Boston and Baltimore as well as Washington, D.C. Hell, he could probably spend a month in the Smithsonian alone. By the afternoon, he was ready to leave. He gave his rod and reel to a youngster who had been hanging around the pier. The urchin looked sad and hungry and professed a real love for fishing but couldn't afford the gear. Mark gave him everything that he had. The boy was ecstatic. Mark then went and bought a bus ticket. He planned to use the bus to get to the nearest city with an international airport. From there, he could fly anywhere. Mark spent the next year traveling. He would spend a week or so, maybe more in a city. Tiring of motels and hotels, he finally purchased a large RV, a Class A model, and used it as his mobile domicile. He would drive to a new city, find a good RV park, rent a car, and then explore. He visited museums and parks. He attended ball games of every sort. Professional, college, or even high school didn't make a difference to him. He sometimes went to a bar or pub, and got to know some of the regular patrons. He never drank to excess but was always ready to stand around if necessary. Sometimes he connected with a local lass. He was very skittish around married women. He didn't want to do to some other poor slob what Dale had done to him. He would be up for just a night or two, or sometimes even 3 with a woman before moving on. He had no intention of trying for a long-term relationship until some things were settled at home. Willa fought the divorce. She demanded counseling. Mark's lawyer agreed, but stated no one knew exactly where Mark was, so the judge decided against it. She demanded the lion's share of the business, citing how they had suffered, she especially, while getting it off the ground. Mark's attorney countered that Mark had set up the corporation so that Willa was in an advisory position only. She could sell her share but could not demand the business be sold. He presented the original paperwork setting up the corporation, and her signature was on the appropriate spot, and the other pages had her initials. The judge ordered that the corporation make sure to give Willa her share of the profit on a quarterly basis. It would keep her in a nice lifestyle, but not an extravagant one. Mark gave Willa the house and the cars. As a matter of fact, he gave her everything in the house also. There was a good-sized gun collection, as well as the antiques she had gathered over time. The value of the package was substantial. Willa had also inherited Dale's position at Timmins Electronics. Dale had disappeared to parts unknown when his accounting practices had come to light. The SEC was looking for him concerning other matters. With Dale gone, there was no one at the helm, so Willa had stepped up and taken the job as helmsman and had brought the company back from the brink of bankruptcy. The board of directors supported her wholeheartedly. She was paid well. She was paid so well that she didn't need to gut Mark's company to maintain her lifestyle. Through his attorney, Mark learned that Willa really just wanted a sit-down meeting where she could present her case to him. Mark finally agreed. He came into town as he had left it, on the bus. He had parked the RV 100 miles away in a national forest and then got a taxi ride to the bus depot. At the end of the bus ride, he used a taxi to get to the large hotel where he was to meet his estranged wife. He arrived early enough that he could walk around and scope out anyone watching. He wasn't too concerned about the police anymore, but wasn't taking any chances. He knew there were still some charges pending against him, but the original district attorney was defeated in his re-election bid, and the new DA was up to his eyeballs in gang and drug crime, culminating in a shooting at a nightclub where 8 people were killed. The poor man and his staff were working many late hours trying to bring the shooters to justice. Mark was small potatoes and had been an embarrassment to the previous administration, not the current one. Mark entered the hotel and met his attorney, and they proceeded to the small meeting room that had been arranged for them. Soon Willa and her attorney joined them. Introductions were made, and they all were soon seated with a beverage of each person's choice in front of them. Mark leaned back and crossed his legs as he sipped his large mug of coffee and contemplated his wife. Willa looked good, just older and a little worn. He supposed that the rigors of the new job were taking its toll on her. Willa sat and took in the man she had been married to for so many years, but now was almost a stranger. He was thinner, but looked like he was in shape. He had a nicely groomed goatee, and his hair was fashionably long but well kept. His clothing was not the suit and tie he used to wear. No, it was clean khakis and a nice button-down shirt. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "You called for this meeting. Why don't you start talking?" Willa made quick eye contact with her attorney. At his small nod, she cleared her throat and began. "Mark, first I want to apologize for hurting you. That was never my intention when Dale and I started to see each other outside the office. It was no fault on your part. I guess we just started working together later and later, and finally we just started to relax and have late meals together. It led from one thing to another until we were in bed together. He wasn't bigger than you or better in bed, just different." As Willa started to talk, Mark took out a small tablet and started to make marks on the page. He continued as long as she was talking. She continued, "I still love you and want to be married to you. I think we can get by this. I have asked for counseling, and I think we can have stronger marriage than we had before. I know now that cheating hurts everyone. You can move right back into the house. I have not changed anything. All of your stuff is there. We will be happy, just wait and see." Mark kept making marks on his paper. Finally, he was done. "Yep, just as I imagined. You hit most of the excuses right out of the cheater's handbook. The only thing you didn't try was the old 'it's not you, it's me.' And the one that goes, 'You never suffered from a lack of loving.' I just have to ask about the children we had planned on having. We are now a full year older than the last time I asked you." He showed her the paper. He had jotted down various explanations and excuses he had found for cheating by reading stories on the internet. He had a mark by most every excuse on the page. Willa blanched a little. She was used to negotiating contracts now, and usually came out ahead, actually very far ahead. Why last week, she had negotiated a sweet deal with Kelly Parsons for warehouse space that was very good for Timmons Electronics. I just thought that we were getting a little old for kids. Besides, my job is tough. It is a full-time, 60 to 80 hours a week, job that requires a lot of my time. We are trying to keep from closing the company down. I don't have time for... Her voice trailed off as she realized that her honest answer wasn't what Mark was hoping for. Well, Willa, here we have an impasse. I have found that I can maintain a connection to our company by employing top people to handle the day-to-day work and just be available to handle emergencies and contracts. I have allowed Kelly a lot of latitude in even contracts, so I only have to be available for new large contracts. You have decided that Timmons Electronics cannot survive without you there every minute of the day. I really don't know why you believe I should come back. I would see you less than when you were screwing Dale, and I bet the sex would be even less than then. Mark stood. He knew when a negotiation was over. Why don't you find another stud to screw in your office? That's all you need. He didn't wait for an answer but left and started to walk to the bus depot. Mark was a little surprised that Willa didn't try to stop him since she professed such a great love for him. He didn't waste any time by just strolling towards his future. No, his stride was full and his steps were quick. His intention was to call his attorney when he got on the bus and have him proceed with the divorce. He was at peace with being single. Once he was totally free, he could put down roots somewhere and then see about finding a woman to complement his lifestyle. He barely noticed the police cruiser sitting at the depot as he entered the small waiting room and went to purchase his ticket. "Excuse me, sir. Might you be Mark Wallace?" came from behind him. Mark turned and answered the patrolman. "Yes, I am Mark Wallace. Is there something wrong?" "Sir, you are under arrest for false reporting and conspiring to bring false charges against Willa Wallace and Dale Timmons. Please put your hands on top of your head and turn and face the wall, sir." Mark complied. He didn't think the new DA would be looking for him. Willa must have called the cops when he left the conference. Soon he was handcuffed and then patted down. After that, he was hauled into the police station and booked. Then he was placed into a holding cell to wait for transport to the jail. No one bothered to talk to him or even ask a question. At the jail, he was photographed and fingerprinted and then put in a holding cell to wait for his lawyer. He was not forced to put on the orange jumpsuit as the deputy chaperoning him told him that he would just have to make bail and then would be released. His attorney made his appearance and reassured Mark that he was already in contact with the assistant DA. He was proposing a plea deal that would keep Mark out of jail and a minimum of probation. He felt it would be accepted and Mark would be out of trouble with little fuss. Mark agreed to the plan. Mark was then taken in front of the judge. Since this was just a bail hearing, the judge asked a couple of questions. The biggie was whether Mark was a flight risk. Mark answered truthfully that he was essentially homeless since his RV was his domicile, and that wasn't considered a home by most people. He promised to have the RV moved to a park in town so that he would not violate the terms of a bond. Suddenly, another attorney approached the bench. "Your Honor, if I may speak, I represent Willa Wallace, Mark's wife. He has a domicile here in the city, and she is ready to put up the entire cost of bail and assures the court that he will not skip. As a matter of fact, she is requesting that he be placed under house arrest with an ankle monitoring device to help assure the court of his willingness to comply with the terms of the bond." Mark grimaced at his attorney. There was no way he would agree to be incarcerated in a house with Willa. He assumed that Willa was terminally pissed at him and would be wanting payback for the public humiliation he had heaped on her. Being ankle monitored where she could get to him was not in his best interest. The judge was pondering Willa's attorney's request. Mark nudged his attorney and whispered to him. The attorney nodded. "Your Honor, while my client is thankful of his wife's offer of domicile and bail, he believes that this is not in his best interest. Your Honor may not remember the events leading up to today, but my client feels that this arrangement may be a ploy by his estranged wife to exact a measure of revenge against my client for the humiliation that he caused her when he made her affair with her boss public. My client respectfully requests that other accommodations be made for his bail. He is willing to surrender his passport and be monitored via electronic means, but not at his former address, and not with his estranged wife in attendance. Your client is willing to risk being incarcerated if I do not agree with him?" "Yes, sir, Your Honor. My client is willing to be placed in general population in the jail and would then request a speedy trial at the court's earliest convenience." "I see. I believe that I will adjourn this court for a short recess. Would the respective attorneys please join me in chambers?" With that comment, the judge lowered his gavel and led the prosecuting attorney, Mark's attorney, and Willa's representative to his chambers behind the bench. They were gone for approximately 15 minutes. Mark was forced to just sit there and be bored and uncomfortable as he was being eyed by the bailiff at all times. Finally, the attorneys came back out. Willa's attorney didn't look too pleased. Mark took heart with that. Mark's attorney led Mark outside to a quiet spot to confer. The bailiff accompanied them but didn't handcuff Mark. When they were alone, Mark's attorney spoke. "Mark, the judge is sympathetic. He actually had a laugh when reminded of what you did to punk your wife and her lover. The prosecuting attorney also wants this handled quickly and quietly. There are other pressing events that are distracting him. He doesn't want this to go to trial. Would you be willing to plead guilty if the judge then suspends your sentence and gives you probation?" Mark sat and thought about it. He was guilty and he knew that he could go to jail if convicted. He nodded his agreement and they went back into the courtroom. His attorney conferred with the prosecutor for a moment and the judge called the proceedings back to order. Mark stood and pled guilty to the charge of making a false police report. The judge sentenced Mark to a $1,000 fine and a year of probation. With that, Mark was a free man. Mark was processed out of the jail and he called Kelly Parsons. "Kelly, I will be here in town for a year serving my probation. Please make arrangements to have my RV brought here. Also, do we have any accommodations available?" "Mark, I have just the place. I used the profits from last year to purchase an upscale small apartment building. We rent out 4 of the units and keep the last 2 for visiting clientele. Both are 2-bedroom units with full furnishing. You just need to decide which one you want, and I will make all the arrangements." Mark thanked his COO and his attorney gave him a ride to the 3-story apartment house. He chose the one that suited him best. It was on the 3rd floor and was quite spacious. It was also furnished with higher-end furniture. After calling Kelly back about which one he was taking, a delivery person soon arrived with food staples and a case of beer. Later that afternoon, his RV was delivered by a couple of his employees who had volunteered to retrieve his pride and joy. Mark also arranged to have a car delivered so he could get around town easier. He moved some clothes and his computer from the RV to the condo and he was soon set. He had a quiet evening in his new home and went into the office the next morning. It had been months since the last time he darkened the doors of his business, so he was pleased to see the modernization and renovation that Kelly had accomplished since he had left on his sabbatical. His older employees all came to say hello, and he was introduced to new employees. Most were very quiet when introduced. Kelly smiled and informed Mark that all employees had heard about the incident at the Wallace household, and the new employees were in awe of how Mark had set up and punished Willa and Dale. In the office, the gloves came off, so to speak. Kelly started out. "What are your plans for the company? Are you coming back to run the place? If so, where does that leave me?" With a smile, Mark answered honestly. "Kelly, you have done a great job, probably better than me. The company was doing well, and even expanding. I know you have a couple more big companies looking to us for buildings to house large inventories and maybe a new distribution center. I have a couple of ideas on how to leverage us to a new level that I want to run by you. As for taking back control, I'm not sure I want to do that. I have enjoyed my hands-off approach to the company and I trust you to make good sound decisions to help keep us profitable. As a matter of fact, I also need to talk to you about how to keep you here. Would a percentage of the corporation help you to realize how important you are to me?" Kelly grinned at her boss. She had been confident that he wouldn't throw her out into the cold, but the offer of a percentage of the business was a nice inducement to stay and be a team player. They discussed options as well as Mark's idea to expand the company to new cities and try to repeat their success. They developed a timeline of finding empty or blighted properties to purchase and get the expansion started. Mark was insistent that Kelly remain in charge, and he would help to find new clients after the warehouses were started in their next target city, but Kelly threw a wrench into the fire. "Mark, I want to be your CEO or COO, whichever you desire, but I also want some time off to start my family. My husband and I have been anxiously waiting for the right moment to have a baby, and I am pleased to announce that I am 6 weeks pregnant. If you are willing, would you please take back the reins of the company until I feel ready to resume?" Mark didn't know if he wanted to be that involved with the business again, but Kelly was a gem and not replaceable, so he tamped down his concerns and gave his biggest smile. "Of course, that is okay with me. I will keep your seat warm for however long you need to get this new Parsons kid up and running." Kelly gave him a hug. "By the way, how would you like to be his or her godfather?" To say that Mark was humbled by the request would be a great understatement. He was speechless for a short moment in time before breaking out in a grin and giving a great big yes to her. He grabbed her and gave her a big hug and wished her a wonderful motherhood experience. During the next weeks, Mark was brought up to speed on the current status of the business and Kelly's ideas for expansion locally. He heartily approved of them all. Because Willa was a co-owner, she had to be read in on all the plans, and she did not express any real doubts on them all. Willa tried many times and used various, and sometimes unlikely means to get Mark to sit down and try to resuscitate their marriage. She failed each and every time. Instead, she got the judge to order counseling. Mark couldn't fight that one unless he might be jailed for contempt, and that might threaten his probation. Mark didn't have a choice on the counselor, so he assumed the counselor that Willa chose would be in full accord with Willa's wishes and wants, and his own wishes and wants be damned. He was pleasantly surprised when he met with Dr. Marcia McClellan privately. She simply stated she had already had a meeting with Willa and that they had a productive meeting, but that she was not able to disclose any of what they had discussed. Likewise, she would not discuss anything that Mark gave her in private. She then asked Mark questions about how the couple had met, Mark's own upbringing, his schooling and personal experiences, as well as what made him tick. Finally, she then asked about the events leading up to the breakup. She never alluded to any knowledge of the publicity surrounding the party and the public outing of Willa and Dale's relationship. At the end of the session, Mark felt he had a neutral person in the counselor instead of the adversary he had envisioned. She never once interrupted except to ask for a clarification. Not once did Mark get any vibe that she was judging him when he was discussing how he had set up Willa. She did ask why he had not allowed the duo to be brought to trial. Mark was honest when he told her that he might have hated what Willa had done to their relationship, but that he could not in any good conscience allow her to be convicted and jailed when she was innocent of what she was accused of. I am sorry that the frame-up that I perpetrated on her harmed her relationship with her family and friends. That was something I had not anticipated. I just wanted to punish her for what she had done to us, or, more importantly, me. By the end of the session, Mark was drained. He left her office, even though it was still early in the day, and went back to his condo and had a couple of fingers of his favorite bourbon and relaxed for the rest of the day. Between these meetings, he was sending out employees to find properties in other cities for the proposed expansion. He couldn't leave the city due to his probation terms, so he had to delegate. It was good for him and his employees. Mark was learning how to trust his people, and they were growing in their experience. Their first couples meeting was strained at first. Willa wanted to sit next to Mark, but he chose to sit where he could see both Dr. McClellan and Willa without turning his head. He needed to see their body language, as well as listen intently to Willa. Dr. McClellan started out by having each tell of their first ever meeting and their early dating experiences. This started them out by remembering the good times. She skillfully asked questions about when they each acknowledged their love for each other and the subsequent progression of their relationship. She asked about details of their marriage ceremony and how each had felt about each and every positive and negative item surrounding the ceremony. She had found throughout her professional life that many long-term problems in marriages had started with the hype of the perfect ceremony. Men usually had only wanted a simple ceremony to celebrate their love for their women, while the average woman used the ceremony to create a me environment where the groom was almost an afterthought. She was happy to note to the couple that there had not seemed to be much personality clash in their marriage celebration. This had taken up a huge chunk of the first session. Dr. McClellan ended the session with the assignment that Mark and Willa had to list disappointments in their marriage, starting at the time each felt that it was getting stale. As they were leaving, Willa again tried to get Mark to come home with her, but Mark just walked away to his car. He then had to lose Willa as she followed him. For his own peace of mind, he did not want her to know where he was living. At their next couples session, Mark started the discussion about their marriage, and when it became stale by citing the lack of communication by Willa, then the late nights at work, and finally the lack of any expression of affection, including kissing, hugging, pillow talk, or sex. Mark explained how this had gone on for months until he finally had Willa investigated. Willa had a completely opposite take on their marriage before the blood trick. She felt that they were still a loving couple, and she was only having sex with Dale, and that was not a threat to her marriage or any indication of how she felt about Mark. Mark had anticipated her response, since she seemed to think that he should forgive and forget all the slights she had dealt him. He then brought out a portable DVD player and pressed the play button. It was cued to one of the conversations Willa had with Dale after sex. Baby, that was good. You do me better than Mark ever could." There was a response from Dale, and then Willa continued. "I don't know why I married him. I almost filed for divorce when he quit working for you and started the warehouse business since there was no money for a long time. My job with you kept us solvent for a long time. I should just dump him so I can be ready and available for you more often." Dale then countered, "Have you cut him off from sex like I asked? I certainly don't want anything from your chicken husband. Baby, I keep myself pure just for you." Mark stopped the playback and turned to Willa. She had a shocked look on her face and was shaking her head in denial. "You mouth the words, but I know different. You claim you love me, but I can't understand why you would think of me that way and still want me to come back to your house. I can only think that you have some kind of humiliation plan for me to get back at how I outed you and your sex buddy, Dale." He turned to Dr. McClellan. "I am sorry, doctor, but I see no further need for your services. Willa lives in a dream world where she does no wrong, and I should just be grateful for the occasional tidbits she throws at me. She thinks I should not need a loving wife, but just be a doormat for her. Marcia McClellan sadly acknowledged his conclusion. Unless Willa made some serious and drastic concessions, there would be no progress. I agree with you, Mark. I will ask to continue individual sessions with you, both as I think you both need help in healing. Mark nodded at Willa, and Dr. McClellan turned and left the office. He felt he needed to get back to work and check with his staff on the expansion locations. Willa followed him to the warehouse. She still wanted to talk. Mark shrugged his shoulders in defeat and led her to the small training room where they could have some privacy and yet not have to sit very close to each other. Very few of the employees even knew who Willa was, so the gossip hounds started up as Mark shut the door for privacy. No one would disturb them unless he opened the door again. This is it, Willa. This is the last meeting. Speak your piece and then get out and let me get back to work. Willa looked at his stiff, unbending countenance. Over the years she had seen her husband when he was happy, when he was satiated after sex, when he was overworked and frustrated, when he was angry at how events had conspired to slow their plans, and how sad, almost like a spanked puppy when she had refused to discuss children. But she had never seen this look before. He looked like his whole body was chipped out of granite and was just as unfeeling. She took a deep breath and tried to resurrect their marriage, even though she knew, deep down, that it was a lost cause. I am so sorry that you had to hear those comments. I never intended for you to hear any of those conversations. I certainly didn't feel that way towards you or our marriage. Each and every one of those comments was designed to prop up Dale's ego. He insisted on it early in our affair. He had to control our lives. He insisted that you should be cut off from sex with me. He was the one who thought up the idea that I should discourage you from having sex with me by acting indifferent to you and your advances. At the time, I looked at it as a kind of prank to pull on you. I hate to admit this, but we had more than one laugh at how excited you must have been. If it was possible, Mark's face became even more implacable. Willa couldn't see how her comments were striking him and destroying his ego. The only thing that kept him from showing how much she, once the love of his life, was harming him was the fact that this past year many women had sought his company as he traveled around the country. No lover had voiced any dissatisfaction about his prowess as a lover. As a matter of fact, Mark was the one who terminated each relationship. She paused to let out a sob of despair as she realized how she must be hurting him, but she had to continue. She completely broke down for a few minutes as she tried to tell him the next part. That night, the night of the surprise birthday party, Dale let me know what you had planned. We laughed about how clueless you must be to ask him to keep me away until the right time. We had sex in his office, on his couch a couple of times. She stopped as she absorbed the look of complete disgust on his face. She didn't know if it was a better expression than the stony one he then regained. With a nod to acknowledge his unspoken opinion of Dale's plans, she continued. Yes, I will admit at the time it seemed a cute prank to pull on you, but, in retrospect, it was a demeaning and cruel thing to do to someone I profess to love. She paused. With a deep breath, she continued. When we arrived at the house, we were laughing and joking about how we had pulled the wool over your eyes. I was especially pleased. Here I was getting great sex on the side, and you were throwing me a birthday party. I was wondering what expensive gift you were giving me. When we got out of the pickup, I didn't even stop to think about why there were so many people standing outside the house. I was so full of myself that I didn't even stop to think about why no one seemed to be hiding. She now gave out a sob. Then we got up to the crowd and heard about the blood. There was so much speculation about what had happened. The only thing that everyone seemed to know was that you were missing and there was a lot of blood. Willa shook her head. I was in denial for quite a bit. We talked to some of the people. At first, they were expressing their well wishes for my birthday, but then, as the gossip got worse, we started to have people move away from us and whisper amongst themselves. Finally, someone actually asked what we had done with your body. She broke down again for a few moments. That was when I got very concerned. More cops were arriving. Some of the people were leaving. One of the cops came over after we were pointed out to him, and he started to ask questions. I asked about you, but he couldn't or wouldn't say anything about you. He just kept asking where we had been earlier in the evening. Of course, we couldn't say we were screwing in an empty office, but that was exactly what we had been doing while you were being attacked and kidnapped. I was starting to become sick. She gulped a little. I think you know exactly what you wanted me to feel, and I did. My husband, the one I stood in front of and told the world that I would love and cherish forever, was missing and presumed critically injured or maybe even dead, while I played the 304 and had sex with my boss. Then a detective came and took us into custody and took us to the police station for questioning. That was where I found out that you knew about Dale and me. They found the packet of information in the desk. The detective made sure that I listened to each tape and watched every moment of each video showing how badly I treated you. Willa broke down again. When she regained her composure, she continued. I was so distraught. Here I believed you had been killed, and they were accusing me of killing you and hiding your body. They kept asking if Dale needed money. They showed me a new insurance policy that I had supposedly taken out on you. I was so floored by the accusation I couldn't think straight. Finally, I asked for a lawyer, so they would have to stop badgering me. We stopped for a moment, and Mark got her a glass of water. She thanked him and continued. With all their speculation about what had happened to you, I even began to wonder if Dale didn't have something to do with your disappearance. They came in and showed me plastic and duct tape from his pickup that had spots of blood on them. They asked about how the business was doing, both ours and Dale's. I know where Dale was when you supposedly were attacked, but I had to question if he hadn't planned on getting rid of you and had hired someone to kill you. That insurance policy would have helped him a lot, as I found out later. She pinned him with a look of despair. For the next week, I was in hell. My husband, the man I truly loved, was believed to be dead. I was in mourning, but I had no family support. My own family believed the gossip and rumors that I had something to do with your disappearance. I couldn't go out, but I couldn't stay in the house. When I went into the bedroom, all I could see was the blood. All that blood. And it was yours. The lab confirmed it. Where did you get all that blood? And then, the police came again and demanded to know about the rat poison. I didn't even know we had any poison in the house, but they could only find my fingerprints on the packaging. I was going crazy. I knew I didn't mean you any harm, but I couldn't be sure that my lover felt the same way. Dale was losing weight from a lack of sleep and no appetite, just like I was. But, and this is a big but, we weren't talking to each other anymore. I would only speak to him at work if it was absolutely necessary. Gretchen had thrown him out of the house and was going to file for a divorce. Customers, first only locally, but then nationally, started to leave and cancel orders. Then the district attorney went on the news and told the world he was going to go to the grand jury for an indictment. Hell, no one had even suggested declaring you dead, and I was in danger of being tried for your murder. She broke down and cried again. Did you hate me so much that you wanted to completely destroy me? She looked so lost and forlorn at that moment. Mark very much regretted what he had done. She looked at her hands on the table. You succeeded. No one at work, no one from my family, certainly no one from your family would talk to me. I was being ostracized by everyone. I would come by the house to get some clothes and I would find graffiti on the door. It was always in the same vein, namely that I was a murderous witch and should die. The phone call started. I changed my number multiple times. I think someone at the phone store was giving my new number out every time, as the calls would stop for a short time and then start up again. The ones that were the worst were callers using your number and whispering, "How could you kill me, Willa? How could you do that to me?" I was hysterical at times. I would call Kelly and she would try to calm me down, but I know she hated me too. She was your employee and friend, not mine. She shuddered and took a deep breath. Then you came out of hiding and called me. I was so overjoyed that I couldn't wait to see you again. I wanted you home, safe and sound. I wanted to kiss you, hug you, yell at you, cry, laugh, scream, sit quietly and stare at you, beg your forgiveness while taking you to task for scaring me. I wanted it all and at the same time. But no, you just let me know you were alive and then you went away again. Kelly wouldn't let me know where you were. There were rumors again. Some said you really were dead and that I was making your existence up to shift attention away from what we had done. She stopped and gave Mark an exasperated look. I know you snuck into town on occasion. I suppose it was to conduct some business here at the warehouse, but you never once called me. You never came to the house. You made no attempt to get in touch at all. Thankfully, you did allow me to access some funds so I could keep up the house payments. Then Dale left town. Timmons Electronics almost closed. I had to take over the reins to try and get it back, and I have succeeded so far. Now came the final thoughts. Mark thought. You finally come back and then demand that I agree to have kids. I am too busy keeping Timmons open to try and get pregnant. What kind of life would our child have if I am too busy keeping a business running, spending 16 to 18 hours a day at work? Please tell me how I can raise a family with that kind of demand on my time. 100 workers depend on my ability to get the job done. Their families demand that I do my job. Our customers demand that I sacrifice my personal life. She was impassioned. Mark would give her credit for that. She finally started to wind down. I just want my husband back and my marriage back. Is that too much to ask for? Can't you forgive me and let us love each other again? She reached her hands out to Mark, but he didn't react at all. He didn't pull back, but he didn't attempt to meet her in the middle of the table either. There was no touching at all. Is it my turn to speak? Mark kept his temper. Willa nodded. She could see that his face was still stone hard. His lips didn't even seem to move as he spoke. She took no reassurance from the softness of his speech. You say you want our marriage back and me back in our house, but what actually do you want? Do you want the marriage where we discussed our future and the family we would have, or the marriage of a year ago where you just came home to sleep after screwing your boss every day? Mark held up his hand to stop her reply. No speaking yet. I let you vent on me, so it's your turn to listen. Willa shrank back. Mark continued. You state you want to be married to me, but at the same time you inform me that you have, and I repeat have, to put in 16 to 18 hours a day to keep Timmons Electronics open to keep the employees, their families, and the customers happy. Where would you have time for a husband? I assume you sleep sometime? Willa nodded. Mark kept on in the same vein. What kind of life does that leave me as your husband? What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to just sit around and wait like a lost puppy for a little pat on the head and a tidbit to eat? I don't think so. I am willing to help in any way, but I refuse to be the second fiddle in a relationship. I could care less about Timmons Electronics. If it needs you unvarying attention 16 to 18 hours a day, then maybe it needs to fail. Certainly Dale never gave it that much of his life, and it was his brainchild and his primary responsibility. He always had enough time to make his wife feel loved while, at the same time, he was screwing you every day. Why do you have vice presidents? Don't they do any of the heavy lifting? I think you need to evaluate each and every management position and cut the deadwood out. He stood. And finally, I want the pillow talk, the quiet, easy time to connect with my spouse. I want to be able to sit and discuss everything from the minutest of minutiae to world events with my wife. I want to be able to show her in thought, deed, and word that I love her. Even if I never father a child, I want to have a life outside of work. I want to be able to take a vacation, not be chained to a desk or have my wife chained to her desk. I want a wife, not a roommate. I will not settle for second place in a relationship. Mark opened the door. I assume you do get excited once in a great while. You seem to crave sex with Dale, if not with me anymore. So, why don't you hire a man? He could arrange to screw you whenever you want. Your life will be much simpler. And get a dog to share your bed if you need a body to keep you warm. A dog is far more forgiving than I am. Willa just sat there as Mark left the room. She was now completely forlorn. She had nothing but Timmons Electronics to call her family. What if Mark was correct and all her effort to keep the doors open were just a hollow victory? Would anyone care if she sacrificed her health and her family for a corporation? Did Timmons Electronics provide any unique electronic gear that couldn't be found elsewhere? Willa felt older than her 38 years as she got up from the table and made her way out the door. There was no one in her path that she knew at the business she and her husband owned. That was another point in Mark's arguments about family. Here she was part owner in a successful business, and she only knew the other owner and the CEO. That was a sobering thought. Was she putting too much energy and emphasis on a company she didn't have any ownership in? Willa made a mental note to check on the availability of a rescue dog. Her house was very empty without Mark there. Somehow she needed to make it feel a little like a home again. Hell, maybe with a dog that needed care she would actually look forward to going home again. In the days following the meeting and clearing of the air, Willa quit trying to get Mark back, and their respective lawyers sat down and hammered out a deal. At the end of the day, Willa would sell her share of Wallace Warehouses for a set sum. This let Mark give 10% of the business to Kelly Parsons. Mark ran the day-to-day operations while Kelly went through her pregnancy and birth. Kelly stayed out of the office full-time for the full 12 weeks after the baby was born. Her baby boy, named James Mark Parsons after her husband and her boss, was a delight to all. Mark accepted his role as godfather even though Willa was named the boy's godmother. Willa delighted in her new godson. Did she regret not having her own? No one will ever really know, but she did agree to be any subsequent baby's or baby's godmother, or even designated as an aunt. Over the years, she finally figured out that she needed to hire the right people and delegate some of the responsibilities so she could have some time to herself. She seldom dated, but did have a boy toy or two for relief of her sexual needs. After Kelly returned to work and Mark successfully completed his terms of probation, he then returned to the road. His RV got a lot of mileage as he went and visited various sites as a tourist and as possible expansion locations for his warehouses. On occasion, he would meet a nice woman who would share his body for a night or so, but he wasn't in a hurry to find a new soulmate. First, he learned how to be alone without being lonely. He found he could be self-sufficient and not dependent on another person for his happiness or even contentment. This took the edge off any new relationship. He could relax and let a possible love interest evolve without stress. A few years went by. His business was expanding. There were occasional trips back home to have a face-to-face conference with Kelly and the rest of the executives. This allowed him to keep his fingers on the pulse of the company and also reminded each of his employees who was the actual owner of the company. Mark worked hard to make sure that no one felt that it was to be a stressful reunion, but that it was just what it was, a way to keep abreast of changes and possible expansion opportunities. Mark would also take this time to get to know his godsons and goddaughter. Yes, Kelly had decided to expand her family and not raise James as an only child. Each pregnancy saw Mark back at the helm while Kelly was off. Mark took the kids on camping trips, hit the local amusement park, taught them how to play baseball, watched their soccer games, and wondered what the hype was, and attended innumerable cookouts. He had to be civil to Willa when she attended an event and found it wasn't hard to do so. Did Mark ever marry and have his own kids? Since this is not the entire story of his life, maybe yes or maybe no. He also didn't regret how he outed his wife and her lover. It was a great trick and was very successful in destroying whatever relationship they might have been developing. All in all, it was a good bloody trick. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.